Vicky Pryce from the Centre for Economics and Business Research. She's joining us from London. Vicky Pryce, good to speak with you. Thanks for being on TRT World's News Hour. Now, what kind of a pandemic-induced population change can be good for cities?
Well, we know that many cities are very polluted, so moving out perhaps helps, and not using so much transport. And of course, we know the problems with nitrogen emissions and the issues that there are in terms of health. So in some ways, what has been going on during the pandemic has been quite good for the section of the population which has suffered in the past from asthma and lots of respiratory diseases. So in some ways, there has been a benefit, if you like, of less transport for a while at any rate, and also people working from home. So that is good news from that point of view. But of course, this has also helped accelerate some of the moves to more green energy. So hopefully when we get back to some normality, we're going to also be seeing a lot of determination to ensure that certainly air pollution is reduced, and that could give a sort of permanent improvement in the way in which people live in the centre. But it has had loads and loads of other implications. Not only is commercial property suffering, because of course people are not using the offices anymore. The question is what will happen there in the future. The high streets are suffering. And remember, the economy of London is a very, very important part of the UK. It's about a third or a quarter of the overall UK GDP, which is provided by London. And not having a vibrant centre, with London, of course, being the major global city that the UK has, is going to be a problem in terms of redistributing anything across the country. If you don't have the financial services doing as well as they did before, if you don't have people coming in and using all the other services that are around, if you don't generate the income, which both the pandemic and Brexit has affected quite significantly.
It certainly has. But we'll leave Brexit for now. Let's stick with the pandemic moves. And I was waiting for the but in your answer there, Vicky Pryce, because there has always been this argument, of course, that you need these megacities, these mega centres for economic growth. And you mentioned part of it there. But I do wonder if this pandemic has brought about a much needed reassessment and maybe a rebalancing, because businesses, on the whole, large businesses haven't gone bust. People have been able to work from home. Do you think this has been like a necessary change in the nature of work?
Oh, absolutely. I think we had been hoping that there could be some greater flexibility in the future anyway. If you look at women working, that makes it considerably easier for them to hopefully in the future provide the services to firms that may need them with greater flexibility there. We know flexibility improves productivity, but in reality, it's also created lots of stresses, particularly for women, but also there's been huge inequality, I'm afraid, in terms of the way in which the reactions have been to the pandemic. People at the higher end of the pay scale, and that's the case in London, for example, have been able to do work from home. Many more tasks can be done from home. So they've generally managed to keep their jobs. Those who are in the more precarious end of work, those who rely on face-to-face contact, which is actually a very large part of the London population, again, have been disadvantaged in that. So we're going to be moving out of this pandemic at some point, hopefully, as we've been hearing from your expert earlier, but with quite a lot of inequality ingrained in the system, and also regionally, frankly. Yes, perhaps some of the other cities and regions can do better in the future, possibly. But what we found is that their city centres have suffered as well. And there have been similar problems in terms of working from home and not using the centres. And now there's a lot more emphasis on towns. Do we want more community development taking place? So yes, maybe there'd be some rebalancing of that sort, and maybe town centres rather than city centres will be the focus, where you mix a lot more, work and leisure and everything else and living. But it is a transition which is going to be quite a hard one to get to grips with, and it will affect the economy quite substantially. And you need good planners, good policymakers to make it work in the long term.
Yeah, and I wonder if they do have those plans, or if they're just kind of making them up as they get along. Vicky, then finally, let's widen it out from sort of the UK and the developed economies and think about megacities in developing economies. I'm thinking about New Delhi, Islamabad, places in Africa, Abuja, Lagos, places like that. The change in population of those cities, will have a huge impact, won't it? Because there are lots of sort of day workers, people who come into the city to work and to earn money. And if cities are emptying out in some way, perhaps they'll be affected. And it's difficult to work out how you can balance that kind of economic change, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think the issue is, where are the jobs? And if the jobs are in a big city, like one of the ones you mentioned, then workers will inevitably come into them. I mean, I'm afraid this is exactly what happens in the UK too. So in the city, there are 500,000 people commuting into it and out of it every day in London. So it's the same, of course, in those areas. But of course, what has happened is that there's been a lot of expansion around it, shanty towns in many places, people who come temporarily and work in those cities and then maybe go back to their own places. There has to be a government policy to ensure that industry and businesses can be more widely spread across the country, so you don't have that type of concentration, because the planning can't handle it. The pollution I mentioned earlier has been enormous in very many places around the developing nations, and something needs to give. And if that pandemic gives a little bit of room and time to think again. But in many cases, it does still require maybe some transfer of funds, more spending to ensure that that happens. And the good thing is that at least the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund are quite relaxed right now about giving extra support to countries that are facing this transition. So let's see what happens.
Absolutely. OK, Vicky Pryce from the Centre for Economics and Business Research in London. Always appreciate your thoughts. Thank you very much for being with us.